Jonathan Ray argues that it was the encouragement that he received from Coleridge and Wordsworth that gave Hazlitt the confidence to develop his own philosophical thinking.
When William Hazlitt died in September 1830, sick, lonely and poor, in shabby Soho lodgings at the age of 52, he had some reputation as the author of popular books on Shakespeare, English poetry and English comedy, but on the whole he was regarded as a pitiful old hack who had written very quickly but not particularly well. In the London literary world, his death went almost unnoticed. 20 years later, however, a publisher brought out a volume called Winterslow, a collection of essays and characters that Hazlitt had written in the lonely Wiltshire inn that he would retreat to whenever he could to avoid the vexations of London and find some time to think. The posthumous republication of the Winterslow essays began to establish his reputation as something more than a prolific journalist or popular critic. He began to be recognised as a thinker and literary innovator who had revived the diffident art of essay writing. Hazlitt had never been complacent about his work as an author, but he was not altogether dissatisfied with the Winterslow essays. It was not just that they could be made to pay twice over, once when they appeared as anonymous articles in one of the monthly magazines, and again when he repackaged them as books with titles like Table Talk, The Plain Speaker, or Spirit of the Age. His essays had given him, he thought, a subtle way of challenging the rampant intellectual vice of his time, the unhealthy combination of overweening confidence and feckless inconstancy that arose from thoughtless dogmatism and what he called slender thought. But if Hazlitt was quietly pleased with the Winterslow essays, there was only one publication in which he took positive pride, and that was his first book, a short treatise on the principles of human action that had been issued anonymously 25 years earlier in 1805. It was, as he'd admitted, dry, tough and metaphysical, written long before he hit his stride as a journalist and critic, let alone as a specialist in essay writing. But it was, he said, the only thing I ever piqued myself upon, and his sister Peggy said he loved it the best out of all his works, if only because it cost him more labour than all he wrote beside. Human action was a compressed statement of Hazlitt's dissent from the so-called modern philosophy, a theory of human life and experience based on the principle of association of ideas, which implied that human life is essentially a series of separate perceptions, aggregated, refined and compounded by mechanical processes in our brains. The more he studied the modern philosophy, the more uncomfortable and irritated he became. It reduced the mind to a mere receiver and passive instrument of whatever impressions are made upon it, and stripped it of what he called its formative power, leaving it fairly gutted of itself. By the time he was 17, Hazlitt was so obsessed with the deficiencies of associationism that he refused to stay on at college. For the next 18 months, he moped around in London and Wem, conscious of being a terrible disappointment to his parents, as he groped his way towards what he would call a metaphysical discovery, a set of arguments that were rather cloudy to him at the time, but which suggested that, as he put it, there is a contradiction involved in the notion of personal identity. In other words, that there is something essentially indeterminate or incomplete about human experience, an open-endedness that the modern philosophy could never account for, and that there is no such thing as a fixed, self-contained core to our existence. It was not till the beginning of 1798, when he was nearly 20 years old, that a chance encounter set Hazlitt on the road to finding a language to articulate his metaphysical discovery. His saviour was Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge had come to call on Hazlitt's father one wintry afternoon in Wem, and for some reason he took a shine to the intense, tongue-tied lad who joined them for dinner. His manners are 99 in 100 singularly repulsive, brow-hanging, shoe-contemplative, strange, Coleridge said. But, peace be with him, he was also a thinking, observant, original man who says things that are his own in a way of his own. Coleridge ended by inviting him to come and stay at his cottage in Nether Stowey, the other side of Bristol, in the spring. Hazlitt set off at the end of May, and after a leisurely week on the road, he was welcomed into Coleridge's cramped little house at the top of the village, and introduced to his pretty wife Sarah and their sons Berkeley and Hartley, extravagantly named after their father's modern philosophical heroes. Coleridge was also keen to show off Hazlitt to his friend William Wordsworth, who had taken a large house 3 or 4 miles away across the fields in Alfoxden. At that time, Coleridge and Wordsworth were struggling to collaborate on a joint collection of philosophical poems. In the event, it would be published later that year under the title Lyrical Ballads. And over the coming weeks, the two poets would take long walks through the Quantocks or along the Bristol Channel, reciting their new poems to each other. The Ancient Mariner, The Thorn, Betty Foy and Peter Bell, or rather chanting them to the hills and the sky, while Hazlitt trailed behind or chased around them like an excitable puppy. From time to time, he would screw up his courage and try out his metaphysical arguments on his poetic companions. Wordsworth proved unreceptive. He regarded the association of ideas as an unquestionable fact, and Hazlitt's attempts to shake his faith left him cross and ill at ease. Neither of us, as Hazlitt put it, succeeded in making ourselves perfectly clear and intelligible. And when the young philosopher started back for Wem, after a stay of 3 weeks, Wordsworth celebrated the occasion with some boisterous verses about the friend who was somewhat unreasonably attached to books of moral philosophy. Our meddling intellect, he wrote, misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect. So close up those barren leaves, come forth, and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. Coleridge was far more amenable. He was a little disappointed by Hazlitt's coolness towards the new school of philosophical innovators in Germany, especially the most unintelligible Immanuel Kant, for whom he had conceived a passion. But he was enchanted when they were out walking on a sandy beach, when Hazlitt pointed to a fresh footprint and spun a spontaneous argument out of it. The act of noticing the footprint, Hazlitt suggested, was utterly inseparable from that of imagining the foot that made it. And the communication between the two perceptions was so direct that it could never be explained by reference to any process of association of ideas. It was a good argument, good enough at any rate to floor Coleridge, and he remarked in some astonishment that his young friend had the most metaphysical head he had ever met with. Hazlitt would never forget the grace and kindness with which Coleridge treated him that summer. It was the making of him, he would say, as a philosopher and a writer, even if he would always remain a damaged human being.
My soul has remained in its original bondage, dark, obscure, with longings infinite and unsatisfied. My heart, shut up in the prison house of this rude clay, has never found, nor will it ever find, a heart to speak to. But that my understanding did not remain dull and brutish, or at length found a language to express itself, this I owe to Coleridge.
Back in Wem, Hazlitt returned to his discovery about the incoherence of the philosophy of mind, the contradictions in the theory of personal identity, and the insubstantiality of the self. But he now approached his work in a bolder spirit. The commonsensical modern philosophy depended on treating experience as a succession of self-contained moments, linked only by the force of association. But what if this idea of a present moment was itself fatally flawed?
If we take away from the present the moment that is just gone by, and the moment that is next to come, how much of it will be left for this plain, practical theory to rest upon? Their solid basis of sense and reality will reduce itself to a pin's point, a hairline, on which our moral balance masters will have some difficulty to maintain their footing without falling over on either side.
The present moment, Hazlitt began to think, was not only built on a remembered past, it also reached forward into imagined futures, and that was why the self could never have the perfect and substantial identity that philosophers like to attribute to it. Now that he realized how the self, instead of being confined to a spot of time, extended both forward and backward, he felt he could see to the bottom of the murky waters of modern philosophy, and all he needed to do was settle down and put his findings into words. But it was not going to be that easy.
I sat down to the task for the 20th time, got new pens and paper, determined to make clear work of it, wrote a few meagre sentences in the skeleton style of a mathematical demonstration, stopped halfway down the second page. And after trying in vain to pump up any words, images, notions, apprehensions, facts, or observations from that gulf of abstraction in which I'd plunged myself for 4 or 5 years preceding, gave up the attempt as labour in vain, and shed tears of helpless despondency on the blank, unfinished paper.
It would cost Hazlitt 7 more years to get his sentences in order and send his little treatise on human action to a printer. And it would be another 7 years before he found his way to journalism, and then to the great achievement for which he is now remembered, his revival or reinvention of the art of the essay. It seems to me that the links between the anguished philosophical explorer who was acquainted with poets and the essayist who is now recognized for his command of the familiar style are rather closer than most of Hazlitt's readers realize, especially at a time when admirers of literary English are unlikely to have any familiarity with the traditions of philosophical writing, and when literary critics are as embarrassed by outcrops of explicit philosophy in their canonical authors as the Victorians were by bawdiness, sex, or bodily fluids. Hazlitt the essayist was constantly reverting to his earlier work on personal identity. Listen to him in The Feeling of Immortality and Youth, written in Winterslow, early in 1827.
No young man believes he shall ever die. Our first and strongest impressions are borrowed from that mighty scene that is opened to us, and we unconsciously transfer its durability as well as its splendour to ourselves. The idea of death, instead of staggering our confidence, only seems to strengthen and enhance our possession and our enjoyment of life.
But before long we realise our mistake and cast ourselves on the consolations of regret.
We are torn from ourselves while living. Year after year sees us no longer the same. We find our personal and substantial identity vanishing from us. We do not die wholly at our deaths. We have mouldered away gradually long before, and death only consigns the last fragment of what we were to the grave.
But Hazlitt's work as a young philosopher flows into the literary organisation of these mature investigations, as well as their explicit themes. The same hand that exposed the limitations of modern philosophy in the treatise on human action traced out the graceful architecture of the Winterslow essays as the vanishing of personal and substantial identity is acted out in the glittering diffidence of Hazlitt's familiar style. A year later he was back in Winterslow, ailing and alone, to say goodbye to the lonely inn and to the plain that had been the landscape of his literary life for more than 20 years, and to compose a kind of epitaph to himself under the title Farewell to Essay Writing.
If I have had few real pleasures and advantages, my ideas, from their sinewy texture, have been to me in the nature of realities. And as to my speculations, there is little to admire in them but my admiration of others. And whether they have an echo in time to come or not, I have learned to set a grateful value on the past, and am content to wind up the account of what is personal only to myself with an act of easy oblivion.
In the event, Hazlitt did not achieve the oblivion he expected. He's been remembered by his best biographers as both a loyal political radical and an unreliable personal friend. And he's been remembered by his best readers as a virtuoso in the complex arts of prose. But I think he deserves to be remembered too for the work he cared for most, his sustained critical engagement with the weaknesses of modern philosophy.
William Hazlitt, Philosopher, was presented by Jonathan Ray and produced by Mark Whittaker. The reader was Russell Dixon, and it was a Square Dog radio production for BBC Radio 3.